Don't want to complain about the rain we've been having, but isn't it nice to have more than one day in a row without it raining? And I have to concur. It is nice to have at least 2 or 3 days in a row without it raining. And it's very pleasant, very beautiful day, and God has blessed us. Yesterday, I have to tell you, for those of you that were there, you know without me telling you, but not every one of us could be there. But we had a really wonderful day yesterday at Piedmont Road. It was tremendous. I know we've done a lot of work with our youth, and our young men have really impressed us all. But yesterday morning, my jaw was dropping open, literally. I sat there in disbelief almost at Caden Mallory and the masterful job that he did introducing that series of lessons. You were there, Tom. I mean, it was unbelievable. Amen. I was so proud of that young man and so thankful of the progress that we have seen in him. It was by far the best presentation I've ever heard from him. And then, of course, later there was a very emotional time when the Tate Williams Scholarship Award was awarded to him by Gary Williams. A very touching exchange there. Our hearts, of course, go out very much to the Williams, and I appreciate and respect so much what they're trying to do to continue to promote teaching and preaching the gospel. What a great testimony it is to them and their life. But it was such a great honor and such a great day for Caden. I know the Mallory's, they didn't seem to care too much, but the rest of us were very proud of Caden. And I'm being facetious. That was a joke. I thought Joe was going to jump out of his skin. He was so proud. And I don't blame him. And of course, Neil Ritchie's son also spoke and did an outstanding job. In fact, I was subjected to a lot of good preaching, and I need it. I know y'all probably don't believe me when I say that, but I think it's going to work. Preachers need to be preached to. And when you go to a lectureship series where it's nothing but preaching, and especially preaching about preaching, it's always good and refreshing. And I certainly enjoyed my day. Don't want to take up all of your time. I know that you were very good students, and you did exactly what I asked you to do, and you read Daniel chapter 10. But some of you may not have been in the class last week, and so for those that were not here, I want to just read that text with you very quickly. You had a comment?
I think people would be interested in knowing that people told you they're watching our service.
Oh, yes. I had a number of people. By the way, those in the booth, just to remind you not to put any pressure on you, but people are watching our broadcast on GBN, those DVDs we make, and we send to GBN, apparently are being seen. And there were a number of people that approached me and said, I look different in real life than I do on TV. Most of them thought I looked better. But no, the shorter was what I heard. But I'm not sure if you're stretching me back there, but it doesn't matter. As long as we're able to get the broadcast out, it is comforting to know that we're still being heard, and now we're able to go through YouTube and broadcast our services live again, and then to archive them very soon thereafter. Appreciate Chris Tidwell in helping us in this matter. He's done a very good job, and something we've been needing for some time, and he's helped us out with that quite a bit. We started a few weeks ago talking about angels and the work of angels, and that's kind of where we ended last week. What do angels do? Which is, of course, where we are right now. And we asked the question, just to kind of rehearse everyone, bring everyone back to where we left off. Do we all have a guardian angel? And, of course, we answered that question very ambiguously last week. And we kind of left it with a few passages. For example, in the one in Matthew where Jesus told us to be careful how we treat little children, because in heaven, their angels do always behold the face of his Father. So again, the question is raised, do we have angels appointed to us individually, or is he simply referring to a class of angels that are responsible for children generally? You know, I suppose it depends on how you read it and how you understand this text. I'm not going to say one way or the other than to say this. I do know with certainty that angels are active in this world. And in fact, there's a sense in which this world belongs to angels. And we'll say more about that as time progresses today, but the world to come has not been put in subjection to angels. And the Hebrew writer made that reference, which suggests, or at least it infers, that the world that now is in some sense at least, subject to the work of angels. Again, we can say more about that when, just bear with me, we'll get to that in time. But I do know that angels are very active. And in Hebrews 1:14, we know that they are ministering to those of us who are the heirs of salvation. That would be, we understand, the good angels, the angels, of course, of God, as opposed to the angels of Satan. By the way, they're active in the world as well. 2 Corinthians 4, Satan is described as, lowercase g, the god of this world, or of this age. So there's a sense in which he rules in the world. And that's not really a surprise if you've ever watched the news, or if you read the newspaper, or if you talk to your neighbors or your coworkers. It's pretty obvious that Satan, in large measure, controls a lot of what takes place in this world. And that is an unfortunate acknowledgement, but he is described in 2 Corinthians 4 as the god of this world, lowercase g. He, of course, is subject to God, who's supreme and over all, but he is described that way. That's the language that's used of him. In Ephesians 6, we are warned or reminded that we do not wrestle, we do not fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So again, we have good angels that assist us, and we have evil angels fighting against us. So we have an angelic host on both sides of the spectrum, the unseen side of things, and they either help and or hinder what we're trying to do that's good. I ask you to read Daniel chapter 10 because this is something, of course, I was asked this question yesterday at the luncheon about politics, and I kind of jokingly remarked, I'm not sure why I was asked the question about preaching and politics and what is the balance between preaching and politics, but for some reason people thought there that I should be given that question about the balance between politics in the pulpit and preaching the gospel. And my answer then is my answer now. Politics has no place whatsoever in the pulpit. And I know sometimes people think, when I say a thing like that, well, you are a real hypocrite for saying that because we've heard you preach. Well, what you've probably heard me preach on is abortion and our homosexuality and things associated with those major issues, social and moral issues of our day. That's not politics. That's morality. And that's the point I was trying to make yesterday, and I'll make again here today. But let's think about the political arena for a moment and the rulers of this world physically. We have in our country a representative republic. We have three branches of our government. We have the executive branch, we have the legislative branch, and we have the judicial branch. And of course, we understand how this country came to be. We look at it historically. We understand how the founders, separated from the powers of England and the King of England. They were considered rebels at that time, and they knew they were risking everything to rebel against the crown. And there was the question on their minds of a very serious nature. If we rebel against the King of England, are we not in some sense rebelling against God? Now that is a very difficult question for one to ponder. And that's what the founders were actually wrestling with as they considered declaring their independence from England. They were conscientious and they wanted to do right by themselves and their children, but they also wanted to do right by God, and that wasn't an easy question to answer. And we look back on history now at their choice, and we say, well, clearly, Providence favored that choice. Providence gave us an independent United States of America, as opposed to just being, some puppet of England or the King of England. So we understand God gave us this nation, and we recognize providentially God did that, but how did God do that? What are the nuts and bolts? And of course, those of you that are familiar with the Revolutionary War in this country, you're familiar with some of the interesting things that happened. Even the War of 1811, I mean, where England tried again to assert themselves here, and some of the things that took place, we say, well, that was providence. That's true, but were angels employed in bringing this country into existence? Were they working behind the scenes? And what about nations today? What about Iraq? Here's one that's current in the news. We went to Iraq several years ago, and we liberated them from Saddam Hussein's regime, which you may think is a good thing or a bad thing. It doesn't matter. I'm not here to discuss that. I'm simply saying we did that. Our military went there and did that. Now, there's strong concern that Iraq is going to break into 3 different nations. Religiously, culturally, ethnically, they may break up into 3 different pieces, and some are questioning now the wisdom of having gone there and taking Saddam Hussein out. Should we have done that, etc.? My question is, whatever happens in Iraq in the future, however it settles the dust of the Arabian Peninsula, however that settles it, do we say we Americans did that? Or would we understand that behind the scenes there were angelic forces perhaps working to bring about the change in regime, the change in this entire system of government there? I mean, these are questions that we really need to ask. And I'm not trying to be political. I'm saying this is something that ought to be interesting and intriguing to all of us. And as we read Daniel chapter 10, I believe you'll see the answer to this question. I'm reading from the New King James text. The American Standard Version, 1901 edition, reads differently in verse 1. I know many of you have great regard for the American Standard Version, 1901, but like the American Standard Version, 1901 edition, the English Standard Version also carries with it a very different wording in verse 1, which makes a different reading in verse 1. I'll share that with you when we read it. But let's just read the text together. And this is the New King James. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long. Now that's the phrase that's different in the English Standard Version and the American Standard Version. There was a great conflict or a great war is a different phrase, a totally different reading. And he understood the message and had understanding of the vision. Before we continue reading here, let's just back up a moment. And I want to just bring you up to speed. The book of Daniel is not in chronological order. So if you read chapter 10 and then read chapter 11 and assume that chapter 11 follows chapter 10, I believe you're making a mistake. Chapter 11 does not follow chapter 10. And I can say that because the very first words of chapter 10, in the 3rd year of Cyrus. Chapter 11, verse 1, it was the 1st year of Darius. Now, Darius the Mede, not to be confused with the Darius who comes later in the Persian kingdom. There's a different Darius mentioned there. This is Darius the Mede, who was governor appointed by Cyrus, king of Persia, to rule in Babylon, to govern the affairs of Babylon. So that's who this Darius is. So read verse 1 of chapter 11. You're reading something that happened 2 or 3 years before what we're reading in chapter 10. They're out of order. You go to chapter 12, verse 1, and you have the continuation of the last verse of chapter 10. So chapter 11 just in the way in that sense. So read chapter 10 and 12 together as a block, and you see it's one continuous message, and it makes a little more sense that way. Don't ask me to explain why the book of Daniel is out of chronological order. I don't want to get off on that at the moment. Just take my word for it now. I don't ask you to do that normally, do I? But you can look at it yourself, but they're not in chronological order. But again, Cyrus, in the 1st year, had released the Babylonian Jews to go back to their homeland in Jerusalem and there rebuild the temple and there restore their way of life. But not long after they started this, the Samaritans, as we know of that race of people, the Samaritans wanted to involve themselves in that work of rebuilding and reconstruction, and the Jews would have nothing to do with it. And so conflict arose between the Samaritans and the Jews, which continued for 400 plus years until the time of Jesus. John chapter 4 bears that out. And so there was a lot of tension between the Samaritans and the Jews, and it started in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. And so there was this great conflict taking place in Jerusalem and Judah, and Daniel, who's still in Babylon, is aware of that and is concerned about that and is agonizing over that and is pouring out his heart in prayer to God over that. And so in those days, I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks, 21 days. I ate no pleasant food, no meat or wine came into my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all, till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. Now on the 24th day of the first month, as I was by the side of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose waist was girded with gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like torches of fire, his arms and feet like burnished bronze in color, and the sound of his words like the voice of a multitude. I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. For the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great terror fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. Therefore, I was left alone when I saw this great vision, and no strength remained in me. For my vigor was turned to frailty in me, and I retained no strength. Yet I heard the sound of his words. While I heard the sound of his words, I was in a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. Suddenly a hand touched me, which made me tremble on my knees and on the palms of my hands. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. While he was speaking this word to me, I stood trembling. He said to me, do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard. And I have come because of your words. Now, before we continue reading, how long had it been since Daniel had first uttered words to God on this matter?
Probably ever since he was attached.
Well, he said in verse 2, in those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. So he'd been praying for 3 weeks. Mourning, fasting. He's asking God to help him to understand. And this heavenly visitor says to him, the very first time you uttered this prayer, your prayer was heard. Have you ever said a prayer and wondered why God didn't hear you, assuming God didn't hear you because you didn't get an immediate response or what you thought was an immediate response? Well, that's obvious, but there's something rather interesting to me about this that's revealed to us here. And that is why sometimes my prayers are not answered immediately. And this is something that we adults certainly know but need to be reminded of sometimes, which toddlers, for example, don't yet know. That is, the world doesn't revolve around us. We're not the center of the universe. And so we're not the center of attention. And so everything that happens doesn't have to happen because of me or involve me in some way. In other words, there's a lot going on in this world. And so when I pour out my heart in prayer to God, I need this or I want that or help me to understand whatever, and I don't get an immediate response, it's not that God didn't hear necessarily. It's that there's a reason for the delay. And we may not always know why. We may not always be told what that reason is. But in this case, Daniel was told why. He said, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me. Wait a minute. Let's stop a minute. This is an unusually described heavenly being. This is an angel. And this angel says the prince of Persia who's the prince of Persia, pray tell? Who is this person? Who is this individual? Well, I'll answer that question. This prince of Persia was not a human being. This prince of Persia was another unseen, powerful force like this messenger that's now speaking to Daniel. And those two individuals were fighting each other. They were withstanding each other. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes. Who's Michael? I learned yesterday, I think it was yesterday from B.J. Clark, Michael is probably the most popular word in America. Has been since, 1913, something like that? It's interesting, but Michael is a very popular name. Nevertheless, Michael is also the archangel, as he's described in Scripture. And he's described here as one of the chief princes. I mean, there are others. Yeah. There are others who carry the title prince. And he's one of the chief princes. He came to help me. I needed help with this prince of Persia. It's a pretty powerful, sinister force. For I have been left alone there with the kings of Persia. So he's outnumbered. Now I have come to make you understand, let me just stop again, because you understand Daniel's been praying and fasting and asking God to help him. It's been almost a month. And he's just now getting an answer to his question. And he's been told something that we're not always given the privilege of knowing, obviously. This is the reason your prayer has been delayed in being answered, because I was coming to give you the answer, but I had to fight the king of Persia. Well, anyone who knows anything about the book of Daniel knows the book of Daniel is intimately concerned with the rise and fall of kingdoms. God rules in the kingdoms of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. That was the hard lesson that Nebuchadnezzar had to learn. And he did learn that God rules in the kingdom of men. Remember, we ended the class last week. Jesus was standing before Pilate. And Pilate said, are you not going to make a defense to me? You're not going to say anything? Don't you know that I have the power to crucify you? I have the power to release you? And Jesus looked at him and said, you would have no power over me at all. We're not giving you from Caesar. He didn't say that. Who appointed Pilate procurator of Judea? Historically, we know it was Caesar. But Jesus didn't say Caesar. You would have no power over me at all were it not given you from above. But I thought Caesar did. You understand what I'm saying? And so when we think about the rise and fall of nations, this one included, the United States of America, we have to ask ourselves, are angelic forces working? But I don't know that we can understand it any other way. Does that mean we shouldn't absolutely do our part? Make our sacrifices, do what we, absolutely. Vote, however you want to respond to that question. Yes, we do our part, but recognize that we're not the only ones with a say. We're not the only ones involved in these matters. Now I've come to make you understand, verse 14, what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision refers to many days yet to come. When he had spoken such words to me, I turned my face toward the ground and became speechless. And suddenly, one having the likeness of the sons of men touched my lips. I opened my mouth and spoke, saying to him who stood before me, my Lord, because of the vision, my sorrows have overwhelmed me, and I have retained no strength. For how can this servant of my Lord talk with you, my Lord? As for me, no strength remains in me now, nor is any breath left in me. Daniel acknowledges the one speaking to him is superior to him in some sense. And I'm speechless. I have no strength left in me. I'm so frightened at your presence. Was this God? No, this wasn't God. This was a heavenly visitor dispatched by God, no doubt, but this was not God. And yet Daniel is greatly afraid. This wasn't the only person, by the way, who saw an angel in the Bible and was greatly afraid. This happened quite often. When angels appeared, people were greatly afraid. Yes, Rick, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, in verse 5, while he's describing, why doesn't he use the word angel? Why is the word man chosen here?
What, in verse 5?
Yeah. I mean, if this is an angel, why isn't the word angel used there?
Well, he's described as one like the sons of men. We just read that also, didn't it? Verse 16. Suddenly one having the likeness of the sons of men touched my lips. Apparently this being had the appearance of a man, which again often occurred. Angels appeared as men. In fact, there was an angel. Some thought he was a gardener, remember? Somebody keeping the garden. I mean, angels appeared oftentimes in the appearance of men. It's a good question. I'm not sure why that designation here. But clearly this is not a human being. Michael of the princes is the archangel of God, and it's not likely that a man is going to battle or in league with necessarily Michael behind the scenes. This is someone else, and this is a heavenly visitor who had access to Daniel's prayers, heard Daniel's prayers, and was dispatched by God to answer that prayer. So whether he just looked like a man or whatever we know else about him, he's certainly a heavenly being of the unseen world who's made an appearance. It's an unusual looking appearance, by the way. Lightning, I mean, we're talking about someone who is it's outrageous the way he looks. It's frightening to Daniel. And then he said in verse 18, again, one having the likeness of a man touched me and strengthened me. And he said, O man, greatly beloved, fear not, peace be to you. Be strong, yes, be strong. And so when he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. And then he said, do you know why I have come to you? And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I have gone forth, indeed, the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. No one upholds me against these except Michael, your prince. What does that mean? Michael, your prince. Chapter 12, verse 1. At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. So if we understand Daniel 10 and 12 to be together and linked, which I believe they are, and I believe that case is made very well by Rex Turner in his discussion of this book, that we read the latter part of the last verse of chapter 10 and the first verse of chapter 12, it really makes sense to read it that way. And chapter 11 is kind of an anomaly, just not sure why it's there. But nevertheless, he's contemplating fighting with the prince of Persia. And then later, after that, fighting with the prince of Greece. Again, an understanding of Daniel, chapter 2, for example. There are 4 world empires spoken of in Daniel chapter 2. There was the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, which was the 3rd, and then the Roman Empire, which was the 4th. And so he's still talking about the rise and fall of these various nations. And so in chapter 10 and 12, we have Daniel being comforted over his concern about his people who have as their prince, which that may answer the question about guardian angels. Do we have a group of angels, class of angels designated to watch over children, maybe a class of angels to watch over entire nations? I mean, that's a good question. And only chapter 10 of Daniel gives us a little bit of insight here, and we just do a lot of guesswork, and we don't want to delve into too much of that. But suffice it to say that certainly these angels are involved in the rise and fall of these nations, and I submit to you that this nation and every other nation, just as Nebuchadnezzar would learn in Daniel chapter 4, God rules in the kingdoms of men. And we need to recognize that and respect that and appreciate that fact. And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't be patriotic. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't vote. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't exercise freedom of speech. We should do all of those things, yes. But at the end of the day, rather than getting all worked up, as some of you do, not me, I don't get worked up over those things. But some of you get really worked up over, politics and things that don't belong in the pulpit. But rather than get so worked up and lose your hair over it, why don't you just trust God that He's going to do what He believes is best? And in the final analysis, just as we sometimes sing, this world is not my home anyway. I'm just passing through. And I want to make the best of it, yes. And I want to do what I can for my children and my grandchildren, absolutely. And if it means making sacrifices, yes. Whatever I have to do, I want to do that. I'm not suggesting in any way we just give in and forget about it. Live and let. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying when it comes to this level of frustration that some of you have experienced because you've spoken to me about it, I'm just saying don't be so frustrated. Don't get so worked up. Don't allow these things to force you to throw things at the television or stick a screwdriver in the radio. I mean, just don't do things like that. It doesn't help, and you won't be able to fulfill your. Anyway, let's keep reading. How about someone looking at Luke chapter 1, verse 8 through 20 for me, please? Here's something I'd like to bring to your attention. When you look at the subject of angels, and we're not going to exhaust the Bible verses on this point, but when you look at angels as they are portrayed and mentioned and referenced in Scripture, it's astounding. They're everywhere. We don't always pay attention to that. Sometimes we just read right over it. But it's like we're reading it and it's not really registering what we're reading. But in Luke chapter 1, verse 8, does someone have that handy? David, would you read verses 8 through 20 for us, please?
So it was that while he was serving as priest before God in the order of his division, according to the custom of the priesthood, his lot fell to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. And the whole multitude of the people was praying outside the hour of incense. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zacharias saw him, he was troubled, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zacharias, for your prayer is heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord, and shall drink neither wine nor strong drink. He will also be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. He will also go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." And Zacharias said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is well advanced in years." And the angel answered and said to him, "I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, and was sent to speak to you and bring you these glad tidings. But behold, you will be mute and not able to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words."
Okay, let's take a moment and notice some things. Zacharias performing his duty as a priest. He's in the temple, offering incense. And suddenly there appears. For those of you that have ever watched the old Star Trek series, and you see someone being beamed up in the transporter, and they just materialize somewhere out of nowhere. So how do they, we're moving atoms and cells and all that through time and space. It's kind of weird. That's just science fiction. That's true. But can you imagine how Zacharias felt as he's standing there thinking he's by himself, and just out of nowhere, there's someone standing there. So you recognize this is not a normal person. This is not just another human being. This is a heavenly visitor. So he's afraid. And then the angel tells him what's about to happen. You're going to have a son. You're going to name him John. He's going to be the forerunner of Jesus. And he said of himself, "My name is
Gabriel."
So they have names. And this is Gabriel. It was not the only time Gabriel spoke. Gabriel spoke on other occasions. But we have Michael mentioned. We have now Gabriel mentioned. But I'm Gabriel. And where does Gabriel abide? Where is his normal dwelling place? I stand in the presence of. And because you didn't believe me, you're not going to be able to speak. You won't be able to utter a word. Not until the son of yours that I promised you're going to have is born, then you'll be able to speak. And that's what, in fact, happened. So it's interesting, isn't it? That here's this man performing his duty, and there with him, though he didn't know it, was Gabriel. Of all individuals, is Gabriel. He didn't know it until Gabriel made his presence known. There are a number of instances in the Bible where the text would say, and God opened their eyes that they could see. You remember Elisha and his servant? And Elisha told his servant, they that are with us are more than they that are with them. And he asked the Lord to open his eyes, his servant's eyes, and he saw that the hill was filled with chariots of horses, fiery horses. I mean, he didn't see them before, that they were there. And he was comforted in knowing that even though I can't see them, these forces are here. And I know that sometimes we hear things and say, that's creepy. I know that I'm not alone. Well, it's not really creepy when you think about it this way. Do we believe that God sees and knows everything? Do we believe that? Is that creepy? To know that God sees everything I do, everywhere I go. He knows everything I think, even before I think it. He knows it. That's not creepy. The fact that there are unseen forces, angels or otherwise, that see me, that may be with me, and I'm not aware of their presence, shouldn't necessarily creep me out. It should, Ephesians 6, sober me and humble me to the point where I'm going to rely, as Jesus did, on God's word to deliver me from all the fiery darts of the wicked one that he hurls at me, or to find assurance knowing that these are God's messengers sent to minister to me and the others who are heirs of salvation, Hebrews 1:14, so I can find comfort in it, or I might find some sobering reality that I'm not alone. But again, just as one passage in Luke brings this to our attention, does it not? That even when we're here assembled now, there are unseen forces with us. I know one thing. If God himself is not here this morning, we're doing something wrong. So let's understand that God is here. He does see. And in fact, in Revelation 1, Jesus describes himself as walking among the 7 churches of Asia and beholding their works. He's walking amongst us as well, and he's beholding our works as well. So again, just be mindful that there are unseen forces at work on every level. Thank you for your time and attention. Hopefully we'll finish this up next week and then move in a different direction.